Welcome back, everyone. This is Liz Faircloth.
And this is Andrea Sagidelli.
We are the hosts of the InvestHER podcast. So scaling takes a lot more than systems and processes. And that's why we're so excited to sit down with Nikki Miller today. She's an entrepreneur that's been able to scale 160 locations in 29 states in less than a few years.
In today's episode, we're going to really dissect what it takes for you to become a leader, and most important, to grow a sustainable business to the size that you want. So no matter what exit strategy you are focusing on right now, either wholesaling, building a syndication business, flipping, new construction, or any other exit strategy that you want to achieve, the ultimate goal is to build a sustainable business. And that's what we are talking about in today's episode. And when we think about scaling, we're not thinking massive. That also includes, but you also are able to scale and build a sustainable business by having a handful of properties. So let's make this happen. So Nikki, one thing that you said is that women should have the audacity to achieve their goals like men do. Let's start with that, because I think a lot starts with the mindset, right? So share more about what you mean by that.
The realization of this really started for me when I had my daughter. I have a young daughter. She's 3.5 years old, and the kid is fire. Like she's me as a toddler, which is very challenging to parent. And it's very funny to me just watching her, being sort of like a witness on her journey, that when we have friends who have young boys, and when she's being really spirited, they'll say, oh, she's difficult, or she's really spirited, and or she's really bossy, or she's really forward. And when the boys act that way, oh, they're really driven, and they're going to be a leader, and look at how they take charge, and just the communication about how they both show up, doing the same behavior, by the way, has been fascinating to me. And I sort of realized that this idea of how women are supposed to behave and what we are rewarded for is indoctrinated from the time that we are toddlers. And I've realized as her mom, my one and only job as her shepherd through this journey is to ensure that not really that I'm teaching her anything, but I'm ensuring that she doesn't capture the beliefs that everybody else will try and impose on her about what she is and is not capable of, and who she should and should not be. And sort of around the time of discovering this and experiencing her journey, I had a moment where I had started a business in January of 2021 that a lot of people told me I was crazy to start. Like, it was a hard, very operationally heavy, difficult to scale real estate model that served real estate agents and how they run their business. I launched that in January of 2021. And about 6 months in, while everyone was continuously telling me how crazy I was and that it would never work, I had a meeting with I'll call them a big name in the world of real estate. And he got on the Zoom with me, and he was asking me a lot about what I do and how it works, and how much money I'd put into it, just really asking a lot of specific questions, which I don't mind answering, by the way, as a business owner. Like, I think we all grow as if we can have those types of candid conversations. And we get to the end of the meeting, and he goes, "All right, I'll help you." And I was like, I didn't realize I was asking for help, but what do you mean?
That's a trigger word.
I know. He said, "I'll help you." And I said, "Okay." He said, I'm going to share this with people. I'm going to help you build this by you just getting to use my name, you just getting to use my network. And you'll give me 25%. And I was like, 25% of what? And he said, well, 25% of the business. And I said, oh, you want to buy 25% of the business? And he said, no, you're just going to give me 25% of the business for my help. And I was like, no. Why would I do that? And I was like, thanks so much for this call. I'm out. And then I had a moment after where I felt what a lot of women, I think, feel when we have these conversations. This isn't the first time I've had one of those conversations. Definitely won't be the last. And I sort of sat down and was like, the audacity of this guy. And I started to get pissed, right? Started to get really mad. And then I sat with it for a minute. And I sort of had this light bulb moment. And I called a bunch of my girlfriends who are business owners or high-level executives. I said, everybody on a Zoom tonight. I want to talk to you guys about something that happened today. So about 8 of us got on a Zoom. And I said, I told them this story, and they had the same initial reaction that I had, which was the audacity of this guy. How dare he? And I said, no, you guys don't get it. The audacity of this guy. He's asking because he's trained to ask. And by the way, I bet that people probably often say yes. Like, he's asked for something like this before, and people have said yes before. He's trained to ask, because when you ask, you get. And the challenge with women I've seen is that we are trained not to ask. We're trained not to ask for help. We're trained not to ask questions. We're trained not to ask for the opportunity. And I said to all of my friends that were on the call that night, I said, listen, y'all, so I see so many women who are waiting for a seat at the table, and they're asking for a seat at the table, and they are waiting for someone to pull a chair out for them. And that is not going to happen. The way everybody else is getting their seat is they are walking up to the table and they are sitting down. They believe that they deserve to be there. They have been trained that they deserve to be there. And yet we are sitting back asking for a seat and wondering why we're not getting it. And it's because we're asking, and we need to just go sit down. And this was just such a pivotal moment for me, where I realized in life, in all things, if we don't make the ask, if we don't just sit, then we're never going to get it. And by the way, that includes making the actual ask of people. And that also includes making the ask of, like, the universe or whatever you believe in, right? I need to ask to achieve greatly. And if I don't ask, I quite simply will not get.
So if we go one step further, right? Why women don't ask? Do you believe that because they are attached to the result? Meaning, how about it? What would they think of me? How about if I get a negative response or anything like that, or something else?
I think that there's probably a lot that goes into it for a lot of different women, right? And I think that there's a lot of stuff around achieving for women, especially. And I think it comes from a lot of different places. I think that could be part of it. I also think that it's that we're not accustomed to doing it. Like, this is a real big distinction that I see between males and females in business. Males help each other. Like, they got a guy for that. They'll make the connection for you. They'll tell you who they use. That they help each other because they're trained to do that. Women are trained not to ask for help. Think about the questions that most successful women get asked. How do you do it all? Right? Like, that's like the number one question, my least favorite of all. How do you do it all? Implying that you're somehow less worthy if you don't do it all. And asking for help means that you're not doing it all, right? So this is just ingrained from us, right? Like, it's from so early. And I see it with my daughter, that if you're asking, you're forward, or you're bossy, or you're not a leader, you're a B, right? Like, it's just driven
difficult,
into us so
aggressive.
Early. There you go. All the words that every strong female has heard, every female has heard in business. And I think that we're on the way to the narrative around that changing. But part of the narrative is, and what I impress upon women, like, sometimes when I talk about this, I'm cautious not to, like, demonize men in business, because I have had a lot of incredible male mentors and have a lot of incredible male friends who have helped me immensely along the way. And I often tell women in my circle that we shouldn't be mad at them for asking and receiving. We should be mad at ourselves for not asking and being upset that we didn't receive.
I love that, Nikki. You remind me of two things. Part one is asking for it and having those opportunities as children, or teaching our children, especially those who have daughters or nieces or what have you, those opportunities. Every opportunity I have to teach my daughter Sammy to ask for something, I look for those opportunities. We did it recently in Universal, where we asked for free tickets. We asked for, an opportunity because it's her birthday. And she's like, I said, Sammy, what do we have to do? She goes, ASK. That's what we say. We say ASK. But part two of that is also, what does that mean? So she could begin to be told that she's bossy and that she's XYZ. And that's the part two of the training, if you will. And I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle. But you've been able to scale. You've been able to scale 160 locations, 29 states in a very short time. So you had to, I'm sure, ask a lot for what you wanted. But walk us through a few of those initial steps. What did you do? How did you set yourself up for success? What did that look like early on for you?
Yeah, I think that the idea of scale or the conversation around scale often really intimidates people because I'll go back to what you said at the beginning of this, Andressa, which is people think, oh, if I start talking about scale, it'll imply that I want to go huge and I don't want to get that big. And I used to think that way too, which I think is a very limited way of thinking. Because I sort of had this moment when there's such a leap where you go from, in my world, it was like 1 to 10 locations. And then very quickly it went from like 10 to 100 locations. And I had this distinct realization where I said, I am spending just as much time and energy to run 10 locations as I could be spending to run 100. So if all things are equal, why wouldn't I just go run 100, right? Like I think a lot of times people are nearing the edge of their limit. So they don't want to scale and don't want to get big because in their head, they haven't made the association yet that going big and scaling big doesn't necessarily just mean more work for you. If you do it correctly, you can do it at scale and you can do it leveraged in such a way that it's not just more work for you, right? And so I sort of had this evolution where I realized, okay, well, I might as well go big because it takes just as much time and energy to run a small business as it does to run a big one. And I think when you operationalize things really well, scale is just sort of a natural after effect of that. And that's what I did. I just asked myself, would this work? If this would work in one location, what would be my constraint in having this work in 100 locations? And that's how we built out our systems. It wasn't much more complicated than that, to be honest. And I think that when we think scale, people often get lost in the complexity. And the more simple you can make it, the more simple you can make your models, the easier they are to follow and the easier they are for other people to follow, which is how you scale, right? You have to get other people to use the models that you've created. And that's really how we did it. It was just operationalizing a very simple model and then doing that in a lot of different locations and learning what had to change per location. And the last thing I'll say on this is that I think that a lot of people get nervous because they think, well, what if it doesn't work in that location? Well, what if it doesn't, right? Like the challenge with scale is the only way to know whether something will scale or not is to go and scale it, right? Like you have to go and try. And the only way to know if it won't work in that location is to have it fail in that location. Because I had a lot of people tell me that the entire business model that I created didn't work or wouldn't work. And it did. It worked really well, right? And yet I wouldn't have known that if I had never just tried it. So we have to release ourselves to like the only way to know if there is a hole in your bucket is to fill it up with water. Like that's the only way. You got to just do it. And if it breaks, let it break.
So systems and process is just like my love language, I would say. So for all the women real estate investors that are listening now and they are looking to scale, either go out of state or build partnerships, try a different type of asset class. So what questions they can ask themselves to make sure their current business is able to be duplicable in other locations?
There's very few businesses that can't be duplicated in other locations. Short of it being like a localized, you're going to their house to do this thing, right? There's not much that I can even think of. And even then you could duplicate that same business model, just get people in that location, right? There's just so little I can think of that can't be replicated. And so if I was getting ready to scale, the first questions I would be asking myself, what are the foundational processes I do that make me successful? That without these, I would not be able to do what I do at the level that I do it. Because I think sometimes when people have a love of systems and process, they get so granular and they're like, oh, well, this is the reason I'm successful. I'm like, no, it's not. It's this, this, and this. It's these three things that you do that make you consistent, that make you successful, that made this work here. And you just take those three things and then you operationalize them in another location. I think sometimes people get so granular and so heavy on their systems that it becomes a cage around them. They can't think outside of that, right? So it's what are the couple things, what are the few things that you're doing that have done that made you really successful, whether it's ongoing process, whether it was how you underwrote the deal, whether it was how you found the deal, like whether it's a mixture of all of that. What are those foundational things that you did? Now take right? Those foundational things that if you hadn't done those, this deal wouldn't work, wouldn't have worked, or wouldn't continue to work. Then take those things into that new location. That's usually what I tell people. It's like, just don't overcomplicate it. Don't get too granular. Take the things that you know are driving your success and replicate just those.
So Nikki, as you began scaling and really started to increase locations, increase your business, you had to do a lot of different things at the same time, I'm sure. And you talk a lot about operationalizing your business. What were those mistakes early on that, I know we all make them. We hate that we make them, but had you had to do it again, and I'm sure you are doing it again because you're an entrepreneur, what were those things that you do differently that you can tell the women listening, hey, watch out for this, watch out for that? These are some of the things that I, made some mistakes on.
Yeah. So many. How much time do we have? The first one would be exactly that I was at the beginning very nervous. I think because I felt such pressure to make this thing work, to prove everybody wrong, that I was so nervous to fail. And if I had failed faster, I could have grown faster. Like if I had just made peace with the fact that failure was a part of this process, I would have grown even faster and even bigger. So that would be the first one. Fail fast, fail forward. You're not going to avoid it. Just do it. And the second one would be, this is a general leadership lesson I've learned. At the beginning, I was trying to operationalize everything and make the system so clear and so process oriented that like nobody could mess them up. And then they just stopped being implemented because they were so detailed and so long and so cumbersome operationally. So I found as a leader, my day to day is not to do and say more with my team. My day to day at this point is actually to say less more often. So what I mean by that is I've got to get really clear on what actually matters. And I've got to boil down everything I say into what actually matters, like what actually drives results. And if it doesn't, I'm not going to talk about it. And at the beginning, like I said, I really tried to control everything, which was a complete and utter mistake. You can't scale that way. And I do think that is, ironically enough, most women are naturally adept at operations and are naturally adept at systems and processes because we live that, right? Most of us are the drivers of our household. And whether you recognize it or believe it or not, you have systems and processes for everything, right? Like you have to in order to run your life. And so we tend to be really good at doing this in business, but because we control them in so many places, we can often be controlling over the whole process in business. And you can't do that. You have to let go of the things that don't matter and focus on what actually drives results. And the last thing I would say is I used to get really frustrated at constraints, right? Like I couldn't do this in this location, or I couldn't do this in business, or this wasn't going as fast as I wanted. And I'll recommend a book that I read about this that really changed my perspective, which is called A Beautiful Constraint. And it made me sort of flip my thinking around mistakes or constraints or challenges that I was facing. And I realized that so many of those, like every great business for the most part is built from some type of problem, right? Like it's a problem somebody had that they wanted to fix. And growing a business is no different. Most great businesses are grown in response to problems and constraints that arise. So we rail against them as entrepreneurs. Like we don't want to deal with the hard stuff, but it's often the hard stuff that leads us to the promised land. It's the hard stuff that gets us to where we want to go. So the more we can lean into that, the better and faster we're going to be able to grow the business.
So you were mentioning at the beginning that once that guy made the proposal to you, you call a couple of people and got into a Zoom call. And I'm curious to see throughout your process, right? We help other people, we support our team and vice versa. What type of support do you usually get as a leader in order for you to be able to lead others?
I am a huge believer in coaching. And I can tell you, I can like look back at my career and year over year, I've paid more and more and more and more for coaches in my life. And I would not survive without my coach. I need him to help organize my thoughts, to help me grow as a leader, to call me out when I'm the problem, which I almost always am, as we all are as leaders. and to help me grow at the scale at which I need to grow. I think one of the challenges that I've faced as a younger leader, especially, is that when you're an achiever, there's this weird thing that happens where everybody just sort of expects you to achieve. And because of that, especially when you're a young, like I said, a young leader, a young business owner, everyone sort of pats you on the back for doing what you're doing, right? They sort of pat you on the back for achieving and for executing, which is great. But what you don't get a lot of is the feedback that actually makes you great, right? And so in my world, having a coach who says, "Hey, you're good, but you could be better. You're good, but you could be great. And this is how you're going to do it." He really pushes me to grow and to expand. And I personally need that heavily in my life. I also have a group of amazing women around me, who are moms and executives and business owners who I've learned from, who have, I hope, learned from me, who we share information, we share stories and share how we handle things and share successes, share failures, and all of that's so important. And then I would say above all, I married a great partner. My husband is a true partner to me. And so much of what I do wouldn't be possible without him either. I mean, we have a young daughter at home, and he's got a big career and a big life. And I can't be the entrepreneur I am and the parent I want to be without him being a 50-50 partner in our life. And sometimes more than a 50-50 partner when I need him to be. And I hope sometimes I'm more than a 50-50 partner when he would need me to be. So I would say those are my big pillars around me. And I've been lucky to have some really great mentors along the way, just really smart business people, men, women, along the way who've really taught me and helped me, and that I had to learn to listen to and learn from. Wish I had done it even sooner.
I think so often though, you talk to different entrepreneurs, right? And they'll say something similar in the sense they have a coach that pushes them. They have a support network, that, at times they're uncomfortable, right? At times they're looking in the mirror and going, I'm the issue. I think that's hard for a lot of people. And Andres and I have had a lot of conversations about becoming unrecognizable, meaning so many people want to grow, quote unquote, want to push themselves. But there's a lot of work that goes into that, right? There's one thing to say it, and there's another thing to actually experience it. And then the third is actually then to move beyond the experience and actually making adaptations, changes, shifts, right? And to be conscious of it. So that's a journey. And I don't think as many people are up for that journey, but I think a lot of the women listening today are. They just don't know how, and they may not know their own gaps. So what did that journey look like to you? Were you always like, yeah, push me, tell me what's coming up for me? Or was that gradual? And how did you keep honest in that process of not keep honest, but stay honest to yourself so that you can have those breakthroughs and not just push them aside?
I think the drive to grow has always been in me. I think I was born with that, but I don't think that I received it as well as I do now in my younger years, especially. Like I used to really resist the feedback. And didn't.
No,
yeah,
Nikki,
right.
Everybody, all
much
the
like
high
every
achievers
young
that are
person.
listening are like, we're going to fight this back and prove you A, B, C, why you're wrong.
I also think like you have to, I always say I put feedback in buckets, right? And if I start hearing something a lot, I'll put it in the bucket of like, I need to analyze this. But what I don't want everyone to think is I take feedback and I'm constantly responding to it, because what that can look like is complete chaos. That's when you sort of, I think you were alluding to like losing yourself a bit, Liz, in that process of like, you just lose who you are. Because I have a fundamental principle that I live by. Anybody can give me feedback. Like you can come tell me how to live my life all you want. But unless you are a spitting image of the life that I want to live in whatever category you are giving me feedback in, I am not going to listen to you. I will smile and nod and be very respectful to you. And I will completely throw away everything that you just said. I literally don't care. I do not care about your, I'm not interested in your feedback. I don't care about your opinion. If you're not living how I want to live in that category, it just doesn't matter to me. Like I always laugh. I've got a dear friend in my life who's been a longtime business mentor of mine, who's been married. He's going on his 6th time. because this one's going to be
time.
different, right? Yeah, this is his sixth time.
Whoa.
And he gives me marriage advice constantly. And I always look at him and I'm like, you still don't get it after all these years. I will never listen to, like, all you are an expert at is getting married and divorced. Like I will not take marriage advice from you because you don't know how to stay married. And that's my goal. Right. And so I look at everybody the exact same way. Like, are you living the life that I want to be living in that category? And if they are, then I'm going to weigh that feedback in that same bucket. Like, if you're giving me feedback about how I communicate, I'm going to put it in my communication feedback bucket. I'm going to say, okay, am I seeing a trend here? Right? Am I seeing a trend here? And by the way, is the trend something that's going to inhibit me from getting to where I want to go? I'll give you an example. I get like the feedback that I am an aggressive communicator all the time. I talk really fast. I'm very forward. I'm confident in how I speak. And by the way, there are areas of my life that serves me really, really well as somebody who is a paid speaker and as somebody who has to get in front of a lot of big rooms, whether it's in business or in speaking, and communicate a message clearly. It's a really important trait and tool for me to have. That said, when you're communicating with people one-on-one, it can feel really heavy when you're giving direction or coaching or feedback, or when you have somebody who doesn't communicate that way. So I put that feedback in a bucket and learned, okay, here this type of communication helps me. And here this type of communication can hurt me if I don't curb it, if I don't understand who I have on the other side, right? So that's just a quick example of, like, I'm going to put it in a bucket and I'm going to analyze it and understand, if I change this behavior, is it going to keep me from getting to where I want to go? Because I do think authenticity is important. And I do think you have to weigh it against, am I okay with this, right? Like, every great strength, if you flip that coin, there's a great weakness on the other side. So you have to ask yourself, am I okay with the weakness that this strength brings, right? And if I am, then I'm just going to keep it. Like, I accept your feedback. I hear you, and I'm not going to change this.
A lot of women that are listening now, inside their own head, they have a little brain that talks a lot, and they say, yes, but that's quote unquote who I am, or that's how Italians communicate, or that's how Latino families communicate. Yeah, it looks like we are fighting, but actually we're not. We're just passionate about it. We can go on and on here with the freaking excuses why we are not evolving, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that alluding to what you're saying, it requires a level of self-awareness, that
very much so,
and putting the ego aside in order to make that change strategically. That I can't blame people for saying those things because they're not even aware of that's happening.
Is that true though? Like, I think they are aware.
I hope so, Nikki. I hope so. I hope they are unaware, because if they are aware and still doing it, then we have a problem.
Well, but the way I see that is, it just doesn't matter to them, right? Like, when I see somebody in defense of something, you're aware of it. You wouldn't be in defense of it if you weren't aware of it, right? I don't get defensive over things I'm not aware of, right? And yet, if I'm aware of it and resisting it, yes, I'm going to get defensive. And so when I hear someone start with that phrasing, that's the way I am, that's the way I've always done it, that's just how it is, you can accept that as your truth. And by the way, you'll live in that truth forever. And I'm not going to stop you. Like, I'm not going to fight with you about it. And yet you then can't come complain to me that you're not getting to where you want to go, because that's it. Like, that's the problem. You are the problem. We always are. Thankfully, we are also the profoundly capable solution. And that's the problem. If you don't want to address it, that's totally okay. But you just can't complain that you're not getting to where you want to go, or that you're not getting what you want, because you're not willing to address it. So that's fine. You can, by the way, I come from a Latin family. My mom is from Mexico. Like, there's no talking. There's just yelling. There's either yelling or loving. Like, it's one or the other, right? Like, and so for a while I used to use that, but then it was, no, that communication doesn't work for people. So if you actually want to be a leader, if you actually want to grow a business, you are going to have to learn to communicate in a way that inspires people and in a way that inspires them to listen. And if you can't do that, that's okay. You can hold on to your truth. You can hold on to your story, but it means that it will inhibit you from getting you to where you want to go, because the rules of communication aren't changing, and how people want to be seen and how they want to be communicated with isn't changing. So that's just up to you. You get to own that if you want, but it's just blocking you from getting to where you want to go and probably becoming who you want to be.
And it's on the flip side too, Nikki, because I've found that people are either over communicators or under communicators. And typically people are a little too direct or they're not as direct, right? They're either one or the other. And on the other flip side, that can limit women and people listening the same way, right? They just don't have the tough conversations. They don't really say what needs to be said. And that's limiting their growth, right? Having the courageous conversations, whereas somebody direct doesn't have as much of an issue there. But, and I really like what you're saying. I want everyone to listen to really just to pull this one out, is that the feedback you get, I like the idea of putting it in buckets. Never thought of that. I like that. And more importantly, where is this feedback useful and where do I need to continue? Like, sometimes my point is that we get feedback and then we just like throw it out. Oh, I just need to change. Like, and it's about changing where and how, and in a very kind of strategic way. Because if you're a very kind of kind, loving person and somebody's going through a tough time, leaning into that, who you are, is really going to be helpful. And being maybe more direct or forthright in other circumstances, right? Or in those courageous conversations. So I really like that. The bucketing is actually helping not throw everything out and saying, I just need to change all this. Like, often it's an adaptation. It's a tweak. It's a shift. It's a pivot. It's not like throwing it all out. And a lot of women, I hear a lot in our community, especially our mentorship program, is that they just want to change who they are. And there's a change and there's an adaptation, I think. So I like how you said that.
I think that's such an important distinction, Liz. And I tell people often, like, please don't change who you are. There's something, like I said, on the flip side of every strength, on the other side of that coin is your weakness. So there are great strengths with being a more assertive and direct communicator. There's also great weaknesses that come along with that too, if that's your natural style. And you just have to learn to pivot depending upon who's on the other side and what you're like, and having situational awareness about what's needed in that moment. So if you're a less direct communicator, your example is perfect. Like you are probably leaning towards someone who's more, maybe more emotionally connected or more thoughtful, more loving. And that's the person someone's going to go to when they need a shoulder to cry on or support, right? Like, we need all those different types of communication styles. And in business, people often think that the super direct assertive communicator is what everybody needs. It's actually not. And I can tell you that that I have to be very, very aware of my communication style, because it works really well in some places and it doesn't work really well in other places. And it's so important that you know who you are. And I also know when to tone it down. And I'll tell you this, as someone who studies this a lot and has worked on this a lot, I always hope that I'm negotiating with a really direct communicator on the other side, a really assertive communicator on the other side, because they are the easiest to take advantage of.
Why you say that?
So
yes,
yeah.
Please tell us more.
Yeah. So because they think they know it all. And if you can make them believe that they're right, then they're on your side. Whereas somebody who's a little bit quieter and a little bit, and maybe a little bit more reserved, you have to be even better with your questioning to pull the information out of them. You very rarely know what you're actually getting with that person. Like, I'll take a direct assertive all day, every day, because they are the easiest to win against. So I really mean it when I say most people aspire to that communication style in business. It can actually hurt you. Whereas the other one, when you're a little bit more reserved, a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit more cerebral, they're the ones that are the hardest for me when I'm in a negotiation environment, because I'm like, what are you thinking? What are you actually thinking? What are you not telling me? And there's always a whole conversation happening in their head that nobody is aware of. And if you're not a great communicator on the other side, like, this is where I have learned to ask really great questions and stay with the communication and communicate in a way that they want to be communicated with, to get the information that I need to get us to where we want to go. And by the way, this is, I say negotiation. A lot of people are going to associate that with business, but you're negotiating when you're with your team. You're negotiating when you're with a vendor. You're negotiating when you're with a client. Like, you're always in these conversations. And if you don't know how to pivot your communication, you're going to be in big trouble.
Wait a minute. I have one more question, because the women listening. No, hold on. The women listening, here's what they're thinking. They are in the arena. They are attending conferences, they have a coach, they read the books, they're going to be reading the book they recommended. Those are the women that are doing the job, and they are getting feedback from a couple of people, right? So they are putting on the buckets there, but there's something still, they don't have a clear like next step. I know I am aware of this matter that is coming up over and over again from my team or from other people that are like trust and respect. It's coming over. And I spoke with my coach about it. I just don't know how to shift or how to take the next step to adapt or to change some behaviors. You got to just end it. Others you got to adapt, but it's still coming up. So what can they do if they are in that stage?
Well, my first question is, does it matter? And if it does, it sounds like in this example, it does. Like if it's negatively affecting you, then I'm going to have a conversation with myself. Like this takes some introspection. And when I'm looking at something like this, if I'm looking at a pattern in my life that's not serving me, right? Like I've recognized a pattern that keeps coming up. I'm going to always go back to like, what instigates this pattern? Right? Does my behavior like this happen when I'm overly tired, i.e. I haven't been sleeping enough, or overly stressed, I'm taking on too much, or that I haven't been taking care of my health? Like, what is it that instigates this? Do I not like people who have this type of personality? So when that happens, I tend to communicate this way. Like you got to figure out what your trigger is to this pattern, because there is a trigger in every single one. Like every single pattern has a trigger. You got to figure out what your pattern is. And so once you figured that out, that's where you start. Like you get to the root of your problem, because often when we're looking at the pattern, we're looking at the effect of the trigger, right? Like we're looking at the outcome of whatever it is that we're doing, but that's not what you need to address, right? That's just the effects. That's the symptoms. What you need to address is what is causing that. Am I an avoider, right? Like I see this a ton in business. I stick my head in the sand and pretend like it's not existing. Like I'm just going to pretend like this is going to go away. I'm going to pretend like this isn't real. I'm going to pretend like you're not real. I'm just going to not address it. Like textbook avoider. And so the way that you start, you can't just look up one day and say like, I'm just going to change today. I'm just going to not be an avoider today. Like, no, you are an avoider. That's who you are. So I would look back at like, okay, where did this even start? Like, why am I this way? Why is this happening? I'm going to probably address that, like journal on it, get to know myself a little bit better. And then I'm going to start little by little, right? Like little by little, I'm going to figure out why this is happening. And also I'm going to little by little start making changes. If I typically would have avoided this conversation, like if somebody, I'll give you an example. I have a friend who's a textbook avoider, and she's the person that if they could bring her the entirely wrong dinner at a restaurant, like she could have ordered soup and they could bring her the seafood platter and she wouldn't say a word about it. Like I'm not going to say anything about it. And so we would go to restaurants, and the way that we helped work her out of this is if they brought her the wrong thing, I would be like, you need to say something. You need to say, I asked for Diet Coke, not Pepsi, right? Like, or I asked for a water, not sparkling water, like whatever your deal is, right? So like we just started small, because the waiter's not going to flip the table and yell at her, right? So we started small. And then as she started taking bites out of this behavior, then it started to change in the rest of her life too, right? So I would figure out, like I said, whatever the root is of it and start taking small steps to address that. And that will help to then solve the effects of wherever it's coming from.
I love that. It's about practicing, right? It's about practicing in a small way versus this big business negotiation. So I love that. And I'll go out to dinner with her because I send my food back. I'm like, get me the right food now.
Well, you always have different, she always makes fun of me because she's like, you don't see a menu. You just see a list of ingredients. Like you can't just make up your own dish when you get here. I'm like, but you can actually, there are literally no rules. Like they will make you whatever you ask for. Trust me. I do it all the time. And so I think that that's a great point though, Liz. Like you got to get people around you who have different behavioral styles so you can see it unfold and see that it's okay. Right. And so, like I said, if I was in that position, which we all have been in some capacity or another, I would just be asking myself, where does this usually happen? How does it happen? How does it end up unfolding? And then just start to address that. And then the last thing I'll say is like, I see this perfectionist trap with so many women because we're trained very early on to be perfect, right? In all the ways, and how we look and how we behave and all the things. And when you're on the journey of growth and of self-development, perfection is the lowest possible standard. because you can't ever achieve it. Right. So you're just holding yourself to a zero sum standard. And so just because you messed it up today, just because you should have said something today and you didn't, or you should have worked out today and you didn't, or whatever, it doesn't mean you can't just get right back on track tomorrow. Like there's no definitive, if you don't do this thing this one time that your progress is ruined. That's just not real. So just get right back on track. Like it is a journey and it's going to take time. You've been living this way for however many decades. Like it's going to take time to undo that behavior.
Yeah. So important. Nikki, so much good food for thought here. And everyone listening, do something with what you just heard, because there's a lot of nuggets that Nikki just shared. Learning about our triggers is a huge step to our leadership. So Nikki, thank you so much. Where can the ladies listening learn more about you?
Well, thank you for having me. This has been an absolute pleasure. Best place is probably on Instagram at the Nikki Miller. Nikki is Nikki. That's where I connect with everybody. And I'd love to hear if you do take something from this. I'd love to connect with you and learn what you learned and how you used it and get to follow everybody's journey.
Thank you again so much for being on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki.